Emma. I currently work at the post-prison education program as an applicant and student services counselor. And I'm also pursuing my PhD in computer science education currently at University of California, San Diego, studying common educational gaps among currently incarcerated individuals that they would need to succeed in a bachelor's computer science program. So I've been involved for a few years now in criminal justice reform, mainly concerned with educational access. What brings me here today is to talk about the criminalization of mental illness, which is a system that not only prevents certain people with mental health issues from living the full lives that we are capable of, but it inflicts an enormous amount of punishment and suffering on them just for existing. So about me, I was personally diagnosed with bipolar disorder in my late teens, after which I went through about a year of treatment, was stabilized on medication by a private psychiatrist that my family could afford, and I moved on with my life. And that's certainly not the case for a lot of individuals. So I just think it's really important observation to make as we go into this, that there are hundreds of thousands of people with mental illness currently incarcerated in this country who are certainly no less capable and whose lives have no less potential. And it's been quite a privilege for me to get to know and to learn an enormous amount from Kevin these past few months in preparing. And so he's going to introduce himself now.
Good afternoon, I'm Kevin Allen. I'm currently a substance use disorder professional, in other words, an alcohol and drug counselor for Lakeside Milam in Seattle, Washington. I'm a recent graduate with my associate's degree in counseling and arts and science. As a native of Seattle, I have lived with bipolar, anxiety, and substance use disorder for over 40 years. And I've completed over 15 years of incarceration, mostly for drug offenses such as selling $10 of crack. My mental illness has been a major contributor to my behavior, but it's only been considered the first time I was arrested or the second time I was arrested, and every time after that, it was never given any consideration. So I speak from experience with Department of Corrections and Department of Social and Health Services, how my mental health has not been considered as part of their treatment nor their rehabilitation.
We're going to throw out to everyone a lot of data, much of which comes from the Department of Corrections. And I want to emphasize that that's available. Emma can get that to anybody, and we would love to get it to everyone. We had some, what I would call damning data sets in the Department of Corrections. We've had for quite a number of years, and because of this presentation, I wanted to give them an opportunity to update that data. And so I forwarded the old data sets to Cheryl Strange about a week ago and gave her the opportunity to have her staff update the data. And late yesterday, we did receive updated data, and Emma will be showing these data sets during the course of our conversation with you. But I just invite you to please ask us anything you hear us talk about. Please ask us for that information. I'll let Kevin give out his personal email. He can't use his Lakeside Milam because that's a place of employment. But Emma's email with post-prison is emma.hogan@postprisonedu.org, and my email is ari.cone@postprisonedu.org. So anything you hear us talk about, if you'd like to know more about it or actually have the DOC data sets, or if we refer to a newspaper article, and there's several that we're going to offer to you, then please ask us for the links. And I think now would be a really good time to talk about one of those newspaper articles, because I mean, Kevin's focus, or Kevin's life story, is the focus of our presentation, and it and I think, and Kevin and Emma, please correct me if I'm wrong or interrupt, but a couple of years ago, Kevin was on the front page of the Seattle Times. A beautiful picture of Kevin on the front page above the fold, section A of the Seattle Times. And the story we'll tell you today is that, what we'll try to persuade you to believe is that government failures, but for government failures, Kevin could have been living 40, 50 years ago the life that he is living today. College graduate, valued employee, clean and sober, stable, much loved and admired by everybody. But government failures, and we'll describe those, basically ripped from Kevin's possible future 5 decades. So Kevin's first time in prison was before the Department of Corrections. It came into existence in 1982, and he was incarcerated in 1981 when the prisons were under the SHS. And there's actually, I firmly believe, and I know Kevin will tell you, and Emma will talk about it, that where Kevin is today is because his humanity was recognized at a point, and opportunities were made available, and he could have been where he is today. As you'll see, if you want to just Google Seattle Times Kevin Allen, you'll see the article that I'm talking about. But where Kevin is today, he could have been in 1980, but for government failure. And it's those government failures and problems along the way that we'll talk about. So, Emma, Kevin.
Yeah, I meant to ask to go to the next slide for that. That was a great introduction. Thank you. All right. But yes, so our presentation is going to be about how mental illness and presented as a comorbidity with other factors that make someone increasingly likely to be incarcerated. And really what Kevin's story, the barriers in place on a societal level and a government level, every step of the way really bring these facts to life. And it's a pretty powerful story. And so we're looking forward to presenting this information to you with that intertwined every step of the way, the lived experience of it. With that, can we go to the next slide? And I'm gonna give, so it looks like, I guess every time someone enters the room, it covers up the top of the screen. But what I'm gonna be sharing a little bit about is a brief introduction to how different levels of mental health are categorized by the Department of Corrections. So these are just some short definitions. S codes from values 1 to 5 represent increasing levels of mental illness. And these are how incarcerated individuals are broken down in data by the DOC. So as you can see, the S code 1 is no serious symptoms. S code 2 is mild to moderate symptoms of a less severe disorder, or complete or near remission of a major one. And once you get to S3, there is a major mental disorders. So that's schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and the like. And so on the next slide, it continues. But
I think it might be good to just interject here a little anecdote about how the post-prison education program is deeply involved in the issue of the criminalization of mental illness as we have been since 2010. And I think especially because I noticed that Cheryl Strange did a presentation during the lunch break, and this anecdote involves Cheryl. So, but it might, hopefully it'll be informative. So, as some of you may know, there's 5 prisons in Monroe at the Monroe Correctional Complex, and the one that houses people who suffer serious mental illness is called the Special Offender Unit, SOU. And in 2010, I got a call from a counselor in that prison, and she was asking me to get involved, not me, but asking me to have our nonprofit get involved in the life of a young man, Jeremy Polston, who's in prison still today. And basically her argument to me was if the post-prison education program didn't get involved with him, he had no chance. And that's literally what she said. And she told me that his diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder. And so we agreed to get involved to the extent that he would and his family would allow, and the Department of Corrections would allow. And DOC ended up being a huge obstacle on that. But after that call from the prison in regard to Mr. Polston, we kept getting those calls, and it got to be frustrating. At that time, about 8,000 people were releasing from Washington's prisons every year, about 700 a month. And it just seemed to me we were getting a staggering number of calls about people releasing into nothingness and hopelessness with serious mental illness diagnoses. And so I was up Cheryl Strange used to be Deputy Secretary of the Department of Corrections and was back in this time frame, 2010. And I know Cheryl fairly well, and I know her well enough to be very candid in communication. So I sent an email to her, and I want to be careful since we're sort of on the nationals wide open stage here with profanity. But I sent a Cheryl an email, and I said, Cheryl, just how effing many are there? How many of the 700 people the DOC releases every month, how many are suffering mental illness? And Cheryl guessed that it would be 100. And a couple months later, and Emma's going to show you staggering numbers, and Kevin's going to talk about the consequences of being one of those numbers. And so a couple months later, I had been asked to speak at a graduation inside one of the prisons in Monroe, the Washington State Reformatory, and Scott Frakes was a superintendent then, and now he's in charge of DOC in Nebraska. And I consider him to be a personal friend and a wonderful person. And I asked Scott, I said, Scott, Cheryl answered this question by saying 100 of the 700 people releasing suffer mental illness. And Scott Scott was over the Special Offender Unit at that time. So he said Cheryl's wrong. It has to be at least, I think he said 146 of the 700. And so that's a fairly high percentage. And so at that point, we started going to the Department of Corrections for data, just trying to find out the real numbers. And this is what we found out. So we ended up with a data set, which we can make available to you, and Matt and Sage at NAMI have it. We ended up with a data set.
If you want to go to the next slide, please. It's on the next slide.
Well, I'll finish this and then you can. So we ended up with a data set that showed that at least 34% of Washington's prisoners suffered serious mental illness. And so, which is astounding. If you want proof, of the criminalization of mental illness. That was it. Almost half, a lot of people who are deeply involved in the prison system in Washington believe that half of the people in Washington's prisons suffer mental illness. But the data set we got in 2010 showed that at least, irrefutably, at least 34% of Washington's prisoners were S code 2, 3, 4, or 5. And we can, and I'll give you a simple definition of that, and then we'll move on quickly. So the data, we sent that to Cheryl a couple of weeks ago and told her that we were doing this presentation and invited her to have her staff update those numbers, because some of the data sets were terrible. Some of the, I mean, unjustifiable. I mean, one of the data sets shows that, I call it the Department of Corrections failure rate, which Cheryl was responsible for at this point, because people who run reentry for her report to her. But there's one slot on readmission which shows that more than half the people who were released from Washington's prisons as of August of 2012 are returning with one or more new felony convictions. And so, but the data set on S codes, and this is this is the updated one that we have up now that Emma's going to talk about. It showed that 34% of Washington's prisoners suffer serious mental illness. It showed that in a 15-year period, and Kevin will talk about this in detail, I hope. I know he will. We've been practicing this for weeks, and it's important. But at least in a 15-year period, at least 22,000 men and women went through male and female intake in the Washington State Department of Corrections, and they weren't classified. So they weren't properly evaluated as to whether they suffered mental illness or not, and very likely could have ended up in a prison with schizophrenia where there was no staff there to meet their needs, which might be prescribing drugs or counseling. But 22,000 men and women went through male and female intake in a 15-year period, according to DOC data, and were unclassified. And that's a horrifying number. So then it showed, that same data set showed, as I just mentioned, 34% or more of Washington's prisoners were classified as code 2, 3, 4, 5. And you'll see DOC's definitions, and they're available. We'd love to get them out to you. But basically, you could take S code 0, which you're looking at now. That's unclassified. So S code 1, in lay terms, would be healthy or not suffering serious mental illness. And then S code 2, 3, 4, and 5. The higher that number, the more serious the diagnosis, and the more required by Department of Corrections staff to meet your needs, so that you don't maybe end up with a death from overdose or suicide. But by the way, Cheryl won't have talked to you about this, but there have been a lot of frequent attempts at suicide in Washington's prisons. It's an issue we've taken to CNN New York City, and it's horrible to call a suicide attempt successful. That's a terrible misuse of words, but anyway, recently there has been within the last 2 weeks, somebody attempted suicide and in fact died, and there's been some attempts that didn't result in death. But so S code 2, 3, 4, 5, the higher the number, the more severe your diagnosis. S code 0, unclassified. 1 is no diagnosis of serious mental illness. And then 2, 3, 4, 5, the higher the number, the more serious your circumstances are. So we can go to the next slide now, if that's okay. And I think a great person to talk. I mean, the best two. I mean, Kevin, misdiagnosis. Kevin and Emma, if you two could please address that. Misdiagnosis have huge consequence, life and death consequence.
Yes. So when I was talking to Kevin and preparing for this, we decided to kind of highlight all of the places where he, in his life, and we know this is not the case for just Kevin, but have run into systematic and barriers. And so we labeled this as misdiagnosis because this is one of the first places that this particular system fails is in missing an opportunity to connect people suffering with mental illness, including substance abuse disorders, with the life-saving treatment that they need. And later in the presentation, we're going to talk about the specific issues regarding the screening process upon entering correctional facilities. But yeah, so if you want to go to the next slide, and then I'm going to have Kevin share his personal experience. This is some statistics just to give it context from a Bureau Institute of Justice report. So these are national statistics. And
I want to just interject one thing here, since we're going to really move into Kevin's life to the greatest extent you all allow us. But, you know, the Department of Corrections was given no less information about Kevin than post-prison education program was given in 2005 when Kevin came out of prison. And we met him at POCAN. He was very candid and courageously honest about his diagnosis and addiction. And DOC had those same facts in front of them that we had in 2005 and did nothing with it. Same for King County, same for City of Seattle. So Kevin lives in Seattle and has resided all the years that I've known him in King County. And but so King County, I think this is systemic failure, and it's at every level: city, county, state, from the governor on down. But Department of Corrections had all the information about Kevin from early on, from decades ago, that we were given in 2005, and government, including Cheryl Strange's DOC, could have done for Kevin what post-prison education program did, and I would argue should have done, and their failure to do that really resulted in the loss of decades of this gentleman's life and decades loss of opportunity. So Kevin, please jump in and throw some at me, tell me to shut up, and I'll be quiet, believe it or not.
I would never go that far. But anyhow, yeah, my experience started out with an arrest for a robbery with a toy cat pistol, where I evidently was thinking that I had a real gun and didn't, and ended up with a sentence of 20 years. I went to the Elton, the intake prison, evaluated, and came out as a normal person. And no one ever questioned why I did this or why it was uncharacteristic or anything. And the end result is I was given treatment that was special because it was my first offense, but there was no consideration for what was going on mentally with me. It was 1980 when I went to prison, and it was 94 before it was ever diagnosed. And it wasn't through the prison system, it was a private psychiatrist. And as you look back on it, much of my behavior can be explained through being bipolar. But no consideration was ever given in those first 15 years where I served underneath the parole board and was violated several times for drug use.
I wonder, is this a good point, Emma, Kevin, for us to talk about what when a prisoner walks into the prison of Shelton or the prison at Purdy, and male or female intake, and where this classification is supposed to happen, and what doesn't happen, and how unqualified the people are that DOC employs to be making these determinations.
Sure, Ari. There's a inventory called the MMPI, pretty famous throughout mental health and psychology. It's an inventory that takes a look at various variables, including mental health, stability, skills, and deficits. And everybody's taken this test, which was invented in the 50s, as you come through the R units or the reception units in Shelton and Washington. But the standard deviation that's set to show that you have a mental illness issue is set so high that a person with subtle improprieties are not even considered or recognized. They're treated like everyone else in the population. And I've never scored on any of these tests and I've been through them over 5 times, and I've never been set out aside as having a mental illness, other than the statements that came with me in my pre-sentence report that was issued by my attorney. So DOC would miss all that. And if it was not for the fact that I required medication that was offered to me by my psychiatrist, it would have been months before a psychiatrist would have seen me in the system to prescribe the medication.
And you could have, if you weren't properly diagnosed, you could easily very well have ended up in a prison where the DOC had no employees that were trained, licensed, educated sufficiently to even address your diagnosis or even to prescribe medicine. The key with proper classification and diagnosis is to have a prisoner placed at a place where they can have their needs met.
Can you go? Sorry, can you go to 2 slides ahead, actually, so that the slide matches what we're talking about? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so what I did find out, well, you just kind of learn through word of mouth, is that you better keep your mouth shut if you got anything other than a perfect disposition. If you have drug issues, you have mental illness issues, if you have anger issues, anything of the sort, it will set you into a heavier security standard, regardless of what your crime was. If you have the case where through classification, you're given the opportunity to go to very low minimum security, if they find out you have mental illness, you will no longer be qualified there. You will be sent to a major institution where security is higher. If you have mental illness, there are certain programs that you're not allowed to be a part of where other people can work and make a reasonable wage. You're not qualified to do because they don't have situations for a person with mental illness. If, like in my case, you're dealing with the parole board, you have to qualify mentally. Your mental illness has to be within their standards before they'll release you. Otherwise, they just continue to recycle you through the program and keep turning you down for parole. So for most of my period of time underneath the parole board with DSHS, I didn't know that I had this mental illness. And furthermore, if I knew, I don't know that I would be honest to tell them, because the way I would be treated would be discriminatory.
Kevin and Emma, there's a question in chat I want to read for everybody, and it's from Jerry Clark Pave to everyone. So the question is, do you have an explanation? Is it ignorance about what mental illness is? Are screenings designed to avoid spending resources, or what is the barrier to a better screening tool and metric? And I'm gonna just tell you what my first reaction to that question is, and thank you for putting that forward. I think it's an important issue. It's the people, you know, I've listened to Rachel Sievers speak at Disability Rights Washington speak eloquently about those hallways where she and I both have been in male and female prisons, and they're dehumanizing in the first place. So basically, you're on a hallway in your underwear, and you've got people of both genders up and down the hallway as you sit there close to naked, waiting to be seen by somebody who actually is not qualified to make this determination. And what if DOC is not hiring qualified people to make that determination, then that's a budgetary concern. I mean, we just watched Cheryl and her executive leadership team ask the legislature for so little money for programs and education that if the legislature gave them what they asked for, they wouldn't have enough money to do the job that they should be doing, that they're actually required by law to do. And I think, and then I'm gonna shut up and ask Emma and Kevin to jump in. I think, going back to that, your question, I think it's an issue of DOC. At no time in the long time I've been involved with them, caring enough to hire people who are educated enough, and so it is a budgetary issue. So, in the end result is on those horrible hallways where these determinations are made. You have people in these small glass cubicles, basically, that are making decisions that aren't qualified to make. And so that's what I think. But Kevin, you've walked those hallways. So we have Department of Corrections data uploaded into our Salesforce with the permission of the administrative officer of the course. And so I can actually go in our Salesforce and I can see all of Kevin's incarcerations. I can see his S code during any incarceration. I can see how they rated him, whether violent, non-violent, or whatever. But I can see when an imprisonment, and so can Emma, began and when it ended, and how fast he recidivated afterwards. And so I know Kevin has walked these hallways that we're talking about at least 6 times during his life. And so Kevin, you want to talk about that, please, sir?
Well, admissions into the prison, you come off the bus shackled hands and feet. You come into an area, you have to take off your clothes and you're given a towel to put around you. And you wait for your number to be called so you can have a picture taken of you and your fingerprints. Then you are asked questions about your mental health by a nurse. She asks what medicines you take.
I'd like to see Cheryl Strange walk down one of those hallways, and Sean Murphy and Governor Jay Inslee also, and not just once. But it's
what it comes down to is, you know, are you treating a prisoner as a human, or are you treating him as a number? And it's pretty clear that the latter is the case.
And going back to the PAVE question, it's not ignorance. It's just, I don't know, words don't suffice.
Ari, can you talk about, because one, with this question, and thank you, that's a great question. I totally agree with what Ari and Kevin had said, and I think that really is a good lead into the last bullet point that I have on this slide. And this is something that's just really one of the most inhumane features of this whole thing, which is punishing behavior associated with mental illness. as
Yeah.
as bad behavior, as breaking rules, and often with time in solitary confinement, which is about the worst way that you possibly respond to someone having a mental health crisis. So it's ignorance, and it's a punitive culture and a punitive system, punishing people for mental illness who have ended up in prison, which was not meant to accommodate people with mental health. But Ari and Kevin, if you want to speak to that last point, I know that you had a lot to say about that.
Absolutely. You know, one of the reasons why a lot of people don't speak about their mental illnesses, if it isn't apparent, is because they will be locked up as though they were a danger to society. When you're able to walk around inside a prison and go to the basketball court, exercise, eat with everybody else at tables and stuff, it's actually considered a privilege. They take that privilege away the minute you're considered mentally ill and you're placed in a higher security, oftentimes in a solitary cell by yourself, where you have 1 hour a day to get any exercise, except with the exception of seeing somebody give you some pills 3 times a day, no counseling. And your psychiatrist, unless you are totally psychotic, probably won't see you but once every 3 to 6 months.
Kevin, you and I went up to Monroe together about 2 years ago at the request of Disability Rights Washington to meet with Eldorado Cadillac Brown, who suffers serious mental illness. And on this slide, where we talk about only the acutely ill receive treatment, I'd like to make the point that not everyone who's acutely ill receives treatment, and kind of what the consequence of that is. And Emma can give everyone a link to a Spokane article about Disability Rights Washington suing the Department of Corrections on behalf of Cadillac Eldorado Brown, and that's his real name. And so Kevin and I sat in intensive management unit with a seriously ill man who DOC knew had really serious diagnosis and never had the answer for that. And you know, he didn't receive, despite acute ill treatment and diagnosis, he didn't receive anything meaningful from the Department of Corrections. And when he released, his releases were not successful. And generally in the community, his probation officer, CCO, out of the DOC's West Seattle office, would treat I'm not gonna call it acting out, but when he acted the way society should expect him to act based on his diagnosis, then his CCO would treat that as though he was behaving badly and by intention, and then infract him and violate him back to the prison. So what he got time and time again, Mr. Brown got time and time again, was inadequate treatment in prison, and then released to staff that weren't trained to deal with somebody with his diagnosis. And so they kept infracting him and violating him back to the prison. And so just where it says, I mean, actually, where we got in the slide, only the acutely ill receive treatment, that's absolutely true, as Kevin just said, but please don't read that as always being true. Kevin, Emma, please.
Right. I do want to, so thank you so much, everyone, and please continue to put questions in the chat, because that's really how we'd love to engage with you guys in this presentation, is by question and answer. And I do want to lift up Marsha Williams as to question, what solutions do you recommend? And I want to get to that. And I'm looking at the clock, and there is one more topic that I think is absolutely critical just to this presentation before we get to that. And so can we skip ahead to 2 slides. So to access to treatment during mental health crises. Oh, one back, sorry. Thank you. So one of the very important points that I just want to make sure that everyone hears the story is in this presentation is that mental health treatment in times of crisis is heavily impacted by one's race and economic status. It's just really crucial to understand that this is not just in jails and prisons, which is a flawed system and definitely unfair to these individuals, but it's not just in jails and prisons. It's really comes up even in healthcare systems where we'd like to think that that's not present. And for this section, Ari and Kevin have a very powerful story that I would like them to get the chance to share before we talk about solutions. Do you guys want to talk about the UW Medical Center?
Yeah, you know, the time came from being a cocaine addict for living on the streets and days without eating and drinking, where I became oblivious to reality and suicidal. And, you know, Ari has said, we've known each other now for almost 15 years, and he's always been there for me at the picking up of a phone. And he's always made every effort he could to try and help me through my tougher times. And this was one of those times where I was suicidal and I was withdrawing off of cocaine. And I made a call. My feet had swollen up to the point I could barely walk on them. And he and the assistant came, picked me up and took me to the hospital to get services for being suicidal for SA or SI. And the hospital basically said they were going to do everything they could for me. And while Rari was there, and what they ended up doing was sending me out to basically a mission type situation where I didn't qualify to be in there when I got there. And I was turned out of that mission place late that night in the 2 or 3 in the morning, and Ari had to come get me again.
Well, I'm going to give them a little more information, and then if you would wrap this horrible story up, which has very much to do with skin color and racism, understatement of the year. And it was a terrible time for Kevin. Our office was downtown in the Central Building for 14 years, and we got a call from Kevin. He was up on 3rd Avenue in the Belltown area, and he couldn't get to our office. And so I think I took Metro and I went up to where Kevin was and walked him onto Metro. And honestly, I thought Kevin had gout that day. His feet were so swollen. And you know, if you're living on the streets, you're not clean and you haven't had a shower and your clothes are dirty. And then Kevin's feet were horrible. It was scary. But we got him back, and he was talking to me about being suicidal, and I believed him, and it scared me. We got Kevin back to the office, and a woman that worked for us at the time, I had her get a zip car. And so at that point, you've got 2 white people, a young blonde white female, you know, educated Wesleyan College, so very wealthy family, and white blonde, white, and me, white guy. And we get the zip car and we go out to UW Medical Center, which made sense because at the time, Kevin Allen was a student at the University of Washington, where to this day he has a 3.2 GPA, which I know he's proud of. But it made sense to take Kevin to UW Medical Centers because he was a full-time student at the time, and as such should have had insurance, and I'm sure did. And Mary my coworker at the time, and I had to just be pushy to get the hospital to admit him. And frankly, we've learned over the last 16 years in a situation, if we're trying to get somebody into an emergency room or a psych ward, we've learned to use the word suicide. It's a word that risk of law, if they want to ignore that, there could be legal consequences. And so Mary and I repeatedly were telling the truth, which was Kevin was suicidal. And we finally, it took hours, got him into the hospital. And I felt like we had accomplished the impossible when we left. And I was pleased. I felt like driving away, I know Mary felt the same, but that Kevin was going to be okay. And you know, after us, the white people are gone, the University of Washington Medical Center threw Kevin out on the streets. The student, UW, full-time UW student, they threw him out. That's literally what they did. Somebody who they had been informed was considering suicide. He was clearly loaded. And I think all they did was they saw a Black man who was dirty, and they didn't care, and they threw him out. And I got home later, and I was shocked to an extent I can never tell. But and Kevin, please talk about what it felt like to be thrown out of that hospital that night, University of Washington Medical Center. But I got home, and I got it. Not many people have my personal cell phone number, or Kevin has it and always will have it. And I was shocked. I got a phone call from Kevin, and he'd been thrown out. And he was at a church on the north end of Green Lake, completely not provided for. So Kevin, can you, I mean, if you want to talk about socioeconomic status and racism, and I don't even know what other words to put on this, but Kevin,
yeah, you know, that it doesn't become terribly obvious until you've lived these 30 years in King County trying to get mental health treatment. But he talks about this example where the hospital tried to place me in an overnight spot and I didn't qualify and ended up outside. Well, the next time they came to get me, and I had good student insurance, and we had proved that, you know, what they did before didn't work. I ended up at Fairfax, one of the best hospitals in Washington. But it's never happened again. And I have been in a hospital several times, psychotic. I've been in a hospital where I was locked up for a day and then released straight back to the street with nothing in my pocket and a few bites to eat. So it's not like anybody's looking for remedies. You know, if anything, we just want to protect ourselves against lawsuits.
And I just want to make absolutely clear, what year did this happen?
This was 2013. And, you know, it only in the last 3 years since I've been sober, and I'm stuck with community mental health, but it was a psychiatrist many years ago that established the meds they thought I should take. And those are the ones I've always taken when I'm in prison. And all they've ever done is just give me these meds. And regardless of the side effects, I blow up and get fat and overweight. I'd be sedated, would get depressed and wouldn't go to eat. No one would adjust my medications. So now I do have somebody who happens to really care. I'm not saying that community health is a bad place, but I'm saying that it's few and far between you find those that truly care in that mess. And they don't have a lot of money to work with, so I kind of understand it. But I would qualify as one of their successes. And it only came because I had support from other people other than just DSHS medical coupons. I mean, it took some people that, you know, some time to sit in their office and talk to. It took some people who have loved me for years and have really just went through it with me. really just standing by my side. Sometimes having them come with me had more impact than what I could say in myself. And I consider myself pretty well. I can speak for myself pretty clearly, but society just simply wouldn't believe me because I have this diagnosis of co-occurring disorder, which is mental and substance use. You know, so often when I was on the streets using, I met people who had all kinds of psychotic outbreaks, some of it because of the drugs, some of it because of just their mental health. But what I've come to learn as a drug and alcohol counselor is you have to treat them both simultaneously because you don't know which one is the cause of it. And I've only received that kind of treatment a couple times in my life. And in most cases, they weren't thorough. They were just doing what was required because DSHS was paying their bill. And I'm very fortunate now to have a couple people who truly are on board with me, who really care about me in the mental health system in Seattle.
Emma, should we ask Sage to put up the next slide? I'm worried about time.
I know.
And while you do that, I want to read this last chat from Jerry Clark.
We actually go to the last slide of the, so that would be next.
Let me read Jerry's last chat. So it's lazy generic prescribing is a huge aspect of poor care that worsens outcomes for people who cycle through incarceration, homelessness, etc. All I can say to that is amen and thank you for the chat. And then
I saw something from Carolyn. I'd like to answer if I could. It was directed at me. Carolyn, I hope you won't mind me sharing this with people, but it's what would have helped you while you were in prison? What can NAMI do for prisoners who are suffering from mental illness in prisons and not receiving support? Well, we can take away the whole psychiatric mental health treatment abilities of DOC and provide independent treatment. One that is not bound by criminologists, but actual people who care about people's health. NAMI is such a place that would be objective and competent. And that would be the thing to do, is to go down to Olympia and intercede and take away their rights to give out mental health because they're dangerous. And the people in NAMI care about people, and they're not driven by the income matters. They're driven by having people be healthy and be given their rights and dignity. And that just simply doesn't exist within the Department of Corrections.
Kevin, I want you to jump in and talk more, please. About...
Hi, everyone. I'm actually really sorry. I do want to interject and just say there's 1 minute left.
Okay.
Well, thanks everybody for your attention.
What I'd like to do is Kevin and Emma close this out. But Kevin told Emma and I that what finally made the difference in his life was he gained self-esteem. And so that's the solution to what NAMI can do and so on. And I've lost everybody's picture here, but I think it would be really good that, Kevin, if you could please talk about what was the solution for you. So drug
the solution was this.
And you graduated college and you became a stellar, you always were, this great, wonderful human being. No.
Well, I'll be as brief as I can. And this is what I do as a counselor today. I try to redirect a person's focus, a focus from their substance to a focus on success. Try to figure out where you want to go. And post-prison education, coming out of prison, will put you there. If you have a focus, you will not have your mind on your drugs anymore. And I was fortunate to be able to get into Bellevue College and get wraparound services. And somebody say, look, this guy's got sense. Let's give him a try. tutors, finances, and it all worked out. But I couldn't have done it alone. And just like DOC will put you on the streets and say, get yourself a place to stay and find yourself a mediocre job where you'll get nowhere. Who cares about that? Give people the opportunity to live a good quality life, and they'll pursue it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today, and thank you so much for giving us your time. I just want to remind you all that there is an evaluation, a survey that I put in the chat. It'd be really great if you could fill it out. If you could just click on it before we end the meeting, that would be amazing. And we have about a 15-minute break before the next session. After the evaluation, you can stretch your legs. There are also going to be more hosted meetups. I will be leading the meetup on NAMI on campus, which is our college program, which will be happening 2 minutes ago, but someone's in there started it for me. And so just make sure to check your agenda so that you have a link to the closing session. And thank you so much again. And please don't forget to fill out that evaluation. And thank you so much again for your amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Just, please, any questions, direct them to Kevin.